All right, all you APUSH people. So, with the Civil War over after Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox, well, we're going to need to put this country back together. We're going to need to rebuild the United States as a unified whole. And so the next period is called Reconstruction. And it begins in 1865 with its opening event. Well, it's the surrender at Appomattox. That's what starts this process of now needing to bring the states, the southern states, fully back into the Union and all the problems that are going to be associated with the process of doing that. So if that's the opening event of Reconstruction, the ending event of Reconstruction is usually seen as Rutherford B. Hayes pulling the federal troops out of the South as a part of this thing that is nicely called the Compromise of 1877, which happened after the complete disaster of an election in 1866, where Rutherford B. Hayes loses the popular vote, but through a bunch of shenanigans is able to come out with the Electoral College win. And as part of that deal, he had to agree to end Reconstruction. And so that's why we're going to label that the end of the Reconstruction period. It's important to remember that the Reconstruction period contains two different sort of sub-periods like we've seen before. The first one we're going to label Presidential Reconstruction, because even though Abraham Lincoln only survived for a few days after the Civil War was over, it really was his initial plans that were most of what his successor, Andrew Johnson, was working for in trying to bring the southern states back. Now, you might remember that Johnson was a Southerner himself from Tennessee, and so a lot of the more, well, extreme people in Congress who wanted to punish the South, they're going to be called the Radical Republicans, they kind of throw aside that, oh yeah, well, this really was President Lincoln's plan with some changes to it. This really was the approach that President Lincoln wanted to bring the South back in as quickly as they could. The Radical Republicans are going to say, there is no way the South should get off this easy. Look at what happened over these 4 years of Civil War. There needs to be punishment, not just, hey, everybody, welcome back. And so in 1867, they're going to start passing things over the veto of Andrew Johnson, starting with, well, the bill that's going to make military districts out of the states that had not come back in yet, which was 10 out of the 11. In 1867, when the first Reconstruction Act is passed and essentially puts the South under military rule, that's going to totally change the tenor of Reconstruction. Now Congress is going to be in charge. These people called the Radical Republicans. So this phase is going to get both of those terms. It's called Congressional Reconstruction and Radical Reconstruction because it's the people who wanted to more fully punish the South who are basically going to get control away from President Johnson by just overriding his vetoes and passing what they want. We're generally going to say that phase goes until about 1870. Because in 1870, number one, we have the last of the Confederate states being readmitted, some people say, just being fully represented, other people say, in Congress again. So in 1870, all the southern states are back. But also in 1870, people in the North are starting to see that as the South comes back, they're not going to be doing what they said they were going to do. They're not going to be keeping the promises they made to get readmitted. And so they're going to have to pass in 1870 the first of the enforcement acts to make the South kind of keep those promises. What promises are we talking about? Well, there were a bunch, but most of them surround the three Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution. In 1866, we have the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. 2 years later, in 1868, we're going to have the ratification of the 14th Amendment, which gives equal protection and It's declared that, unlike what the Supreme Court said in the Dred Scott case, yes, if you're African American and you were born here, you're a citizen, just like anybody else who was born here too. Well, 13th and 14th Amendment ratification is a condition for those states that had not been readmitted yet to be readmitted. And then later, when the 15th Amendment passes, which says that every adult male, notice male, is guaranteed their right to vote in the United States, well, we've all passed these amendments, and so we all agree. But the South starts already after 1870 into the end of Reconstruction. People in the North can see that, hey, y'all aren't enforcing what's supposed, so they're going to pass the Enforcement Acts, which President Grant will actually use as a pretty good tool. The KKK will pretty much be stomped out during that period, only, as we all know, to come back bigger and stronger a few decades later. But those enforcement bills basically are passed because people can see things are going back to the way they were in the South. That's why we've had this gap here so far in this screen. When Reconstruction is over, well, there's still this period. Now that the troops are gone, the South just pretty much goes back to its old ways. And they find all these different ways to while technically people have the right to vote, we're going to find these workarounds that basically keep African Americans from being able to exercise their right to vote. And so we say 1890s here with an S. I mean, that's not usual in our timelines, but because that's the way Fraser phrased it. And I think it's right to phrase it that way because states control their own election laws. And so Fraser says by the middle of the 1890s, pretty much African Americans in the South can't vote anymore, and things are back to the way they were. 1896 is when we're going to get Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court declares that separate can be and separate but equal is okay, along with Dred Scott. Got to be one of the worst decisions that the Supreme Court ever made. Well, all of these things are happening in the 1890s. And so this redemption period, a very positive sounding word for a very negative thing, just basically means that down in what was being called the New South, it's pretty much a lot like the Old South by the time the 1890s are over.